Hello, 242. This is your friend Dale Happy Nose coming to you here this evening. And we wanted to have a little difference this evening. We are in our last day of our Independence Month. And we wanted to take us down back a little bit in time to last year when we had a panel on. And that show was an in-depth, pretty lengthy, and it had a lot of information that people kept asking about. And so what I thought to do is to just break up that show into two parts, and we will show half of it today, and then maybe the other half at another time. And so as we do that, then we want you to sit back, we want you to enjoy, write down your notes, maybe post them, send them on inbox, however you want to do it, and we'll endeavor to answer those questions when we finish. The panel was comprised of Nahaja Black, Rowena Bethel, Dr. Chris Curry, and Dr. Gilbert Morris. So you can imagine from a Power Punch group like that, there was a lot of details and in-depth discussion that happened there that really hit to the core of what's happening in our country and what could happen if we were to do things slightly different. And so we will start now with the show as it was presented last time. Thinking about our road to Damascus, wondering if we have a leadership deficiency? Pause. Think about it with intentional thought and consider where we go from here. Stay tuned and hear the perspectives of our independence panel of Rowena Bethel, Nahaja Black, Dr. Christopher Curry, and Dr. Gilbert Morris as we explore the benefits of strong leadership in building a nation. Join our co-sponsors, Page Investments, Dev Enterprises, and our friends at Islandese Realty, D1 Development, and Sammy's Chicken. Share and post your comments, questions, and concerns, and we will endeavor to address them as we go along. We will be right back.
Something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles.
Welcome to Something to Think About with Dale Happy Knowles. What we think, we become. What we radiate, we attract. And what we imagine, we can achieve. Let's change the narrative 242. Let's become more mature, intelligent in our discussions, and rise the ships on the wave for everybody. This evening, we have a special independence panel as we celebrate our 48th year of independence as a vibrant young nation. And we have Mrs. Rowena Bethel. Nahaja Black will be joining us shortly. We have Dr. Chris Curry and Dr. Gilbert Morris, all very esteemed, highly respected individuals in the 242. That's our area code of the Bahamas. We look forward for a very intriguing conversation this evening. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you very much. Good evening to you and to my colleagues.
Yes.
Great.
Happy to be here.
Rowena Bethel is a public administrator on specialty. Well, you know, if I try to go through all the old titles, we'll be here till tomorrow. But all of the good stuff is on Facebook, or the whole bios are there for you all to read and look up on, and so forth. So we welcome you all to this discussion as to the benefits of strong leadership in building a nation. And as we say, we are here at 48 years, and in the Bahamas, we think we have been around for 250 odd years, like some of our neighboring countries. But you know, we still have a ways to go, and so we want to have a discussion this evening that is going to help us understand some of the principles and some of the key items that drives a nation and us being in strong leadership, how that can have an impact on those areas. And so what we normally know is that sometimes we are a toddler and then we grow up. And as a toddler, we still know right and wrong. The same way we will know from the difference between leadership and management. And so in terms of business and managing people and leading people, we look at the two of those things. Now, all persons will look at things from a different management or leadership model. And so we have those things where we would have grown up through the colonial mechanism, and now we're on to some of more modern technologies and models of governance and leadership and the like. And so we want to touch into all of those this evening in a way. And so as we do that, we want to be able to highlight for you, basically, first and foremost, what is leadership and what is a leader, right? And so for my training, we have maybe a deficiency in the persons in leadership positions, but not necessarily a deficiency in leader, as I see it, because we have a lot of leaders, but they might not be in positions of leadership. But and then there's a question as to whether the leaders have the vision or have a vision. And in that sense, we also know that everybody has a vision, but that doesn't necessarily mean the people who are following is sharing in that vision. And so those are two key things. So in leadership, the fundamental thing in leadership is to lead, L-E-A-D. And that demands voluntary act. There's no forcing in that. There's no pushing in that. There's no pulling in that. There's no dragging in that. There's no bossing in that. It's no authoritative action in leadership. And this is my training of over many moons, cycled many times. And so we want to touch on how being strong in those areas will be able to help us grow the Bahamas to be where we need to go. And then the other part to it is that we tend to mix up leadership and management. Well, I was taught that people lead people and manage processes, systems, and things, whereas in the Bahamas, sometimes we get it mixed up and we want to manage people and then lead everything else. And so we tend to get that backwards. And so what we want this august body of persons here, and Dr. Morris, Curry, Bethel, and Nahaja Black, when she joins us, to be able to break down some of the areas of their expertise and experiences and help us understand how and why we need to do things differently in the Bahamas than what we are doing it today. So before we break into there direct, I'll just post my definition of a leadership which I gave to the panel so that they could pivot on it, dissect it, chop it up, whatever they want to do with it, and present from their perspective what they would think. So Madam Producer, you want to play that for us?
And with the sustainable capacity and skills of inspiring a group of individuals to voluntarily follow them in striving as a team to achieve a common set of goals, a cause, which they as individuals do not visualize with any stretch of the imagination, and achieving such by themselves. Dale Happy Knowles.
Thank you, Madam Producer. So we will kick off this ball this evening by asking Dr. Curry to give us a historic walk down leadership of our leadership styles over the last 700 odd years, from 1492 up, picking out the strong leaders that he would have considered to be strong leaders, how they had impacts and the like. And so we asked them to compress a whole course that would happen for a whole semester into couple of minutes. So give us a framework as to what we're talking about when we say strong leaders. Dr. Curry.
Right. Well, I appreciate being invited to this panel discussion, and I will try to be as succinct as possible, even though you're asking me to do the impossible and cover what amounts to about 500 years of our history. Let me start by saying probably the best example was when we started with the Lucayans, because their leadership style was somewhat consensus or cooperative in how they created leaders and made decisions. Though the cacique was both religious and political leader, he got his position through who his mother was, through matrilineal descent. But unquestionably, they often made decisions based on consensus. And so they shared food, they shared resources. And I think that kind of communal living is something that we might idealize. I wouldn't suggest returning to it, but at least lifting it up as something to be admired. When the first colonization experiment occurred in the Bahamas in 1648 with the Lutheran adventurers, they adopted an aristocratic Republican model of government. If you learn anything about the Lutheran adventurers in high school, they probably would have told you that it was a Republican model. But if you study their constitution, it was far from a Republican model, because leadership was held in the hands of the first that arrived. And the 100 who were elected to the Senate, basically they elected whoever came in when a vacancy arrived through the death of a senator. And everyone else who arrived after that 100 had no access to power or leadership. So that seemed more authoritarian, and certainly not consensus building at all. As you move through the early colonial period of our country, you see that model being reinforced with very bad consequences. During the preparatory period, again, you have a hierarchical system in place where power is confided or in a small group of 6 Lord Proprietors, and they are appointing governors who basically do their will. They made some very bad choices for governors, and many of the governors were very corrupt. Many of them, in fact, fell into the hands of pirates, being influenced by pirates, or even allowing pirates basically to run the show. So this was a really negative period as it relates to leadership, because you could argue there really wasn't any leadership at that time, really visionaries, unless you are lauding the life of the pirate. And there have been some who've tried to rehabilitate the character of the pirate by suggesting they were the first real democracy. And it is true that, outside of the captain and the first mate or quartermaster, most of the loot that was taken by pirates was shared equally. And there was also a sense that there was a raceless society. You had black and red and white pirates all working together. But the truth of the matter is the pirates were sea robbers. And when they came upon land, they vented or let out all of that steam and just absolutely carried on in a very lawless manner in taverns and brothels and the like. But fast forwarding to a period, I guess we would suggest that was the period where we had the most law and order established was probably during the Loyalist period, because they brought a rigid social and racial hierarchy to the Bahamas. And you did see some kind of leadership emerging that I would suggest was effective. But at the same time, it was following a colonial model of leadership, which was extremely hierarchical and authoritarian, and most of the power was vested in the governor and his executive council. And I would say, as you broaden this to the 20th century, you find most of that kind of model of governance, particularly in the Anglophone Caribbean, remain, where power was vested in a small group of men. In the Caribbean, we would have called them the plantocracy, but in the Bahamas, with the absence of a real export crop, and without plantations really operating very effectively, we refer to them as the agro-commercial oligarchy. And I want you to know they were a group of white merchants who controlled the social, political, and economic spheres of Bahamian society. They didn't rule as one individual. They ruled as a cohort or a group of like-minded persons who had their own special interests at heart. So this is an interesting leadership model because it's like the boardroom, right? And the idea is you protect your own interests while excluding everyone else. And that's essentially what the Bay Street Boys did. Now, understand this. In truth, we didn't actually have political parties until 1953. And so the need for a singular leader was not really present in the Bahamas because you had a group that thought and acted and behaved the same way. But when the PLP is formed in 1953, there is now a need for a discernible leader and a leadership style that would gravitate to the people at that time. And so before I quickly move to looking at the period of party politics in the Bahamas, I just want to quickly mention what was happening in the Caribbean in that time. Because what was happening was this was the age of the populist leader, where men, and I stress men, often came to power by making grandiose statements, by promising much but delivering little. And in the Caribbean, also the populist leader, and I would include Latin America as well, the populist leader's profile often was one of authoritarian leadership. All right, he was known for being a macho man, for being strong and powerful and having charisma. And he was great at connecting with people at rallies or any place in the public sphere where you would have a large audience where you could speak to. And the rhetoric was so important to try and convince people that you were about change or that you were for them. One of the greatest examples of a populist leader in the region, I can give a couple, but one that strikes me as important is Rafael Trujillo. And he was the authoritarian dictator of the Dominican Republic in the 1930s. And he had a lot of support with the peasants. He promised them land. He promised to kick out many of the foreigners and to allow them to have free access to tools, land grants, etc. But while he did follow through with some of those promises, it's interesting that he went about a campaign of whitening the Dominican Republic. And how did he do that? By getting rid of the black population in the DR, mostly of Haitian descent or Haitian origins. In 1937, in fact, there was a Blood River massacre where over 10,000 Haitians were massacred in an attempt on the part of Trujillo to whiten the DR. Right? So that's just an example of a man who has a conflicted personality. On the one hand, seemingly popular, but at the same time very despotic. Well, that kind of profile you see in another example, and we could go right next door in the territory in Hispaniola known as Haiti, because in 1957, Francois Duvalier came to power, and again, he rode on a wave of populist rhetoric, known as a doctor, not just a medical doctor, but rumor had it that he was a high priest of voodoo, and he could fix you real good. But anyways, him and his son, who came to power around 1971 upon his death, they ruled Haiti with an iron fist from 1957 to 1985. All right, and they took in almost all of the treasury that Haiti had as a poor country was used to pave the one good road from the airport to their palatial palace. And while most of the Haitians suffered tremendously under their rule, it was well known that Papa Doc Duvalier particularly was very ruthless, creating his own private armed forces, the Tom Tom Maku, and then his son, being more of a playboy, spent most of the country's money on fine wine, Dom Perignon, and caviar. Of course, having connections with France. And so they ran the country to the ground. And that is the kind of populist leader that a lot of Caribbean countries, unfortunately, suffered under. Now, getting back to the Bahamas, as I try to conclude in the next 5 minutes, because I know I only have about 20 minutes of time, I've probably taken about 10 or 15 already. The last 5 minutes or so, I want to reflect on what we got. We rode on the curtails, of leadership that was borrowing much on the Latin American Caribbean model, the populist leader. But there was also a progressive element to the early PLP's agenda. They actually had gone to England and studied the Fabian Society. They were a labor group. They'd gone to Jamaica, they'd gone to Ghana and studied some of the freedom fighters and the rhetoric and ideology that they espoused. And they tried to graft and apply it to much of what was going on in the Bahamas in the 1950s. So they had a progressive agenda, and they realized very quickly that being light-skinned, I'm talking about William Cartwright and H.M. Taylor, and of course, Cyril Stevenson, they realized they needed to have a figure that could resonate with the black masses without losing touch with the middle class and elites who were much more educated. And so there was by 1958 a power struggle within the PLP for a leadership position, as H.M. Taylor and the older founders realized that they had to pass the baton on to a new and younger generation, a younger leader. The choice was between Randall Fox and Pinling. And Randall Fox apparently was too progressive and maybe too radical and militant in his language and the way he delivered his speeches. He certainly gravitated towards the masses, and laborers certainly saw him as a leader, particularly in the 58 strike. But Pinling was a pragmatist, and they liked the pragmatism of Pinling more than they liked the radicalness of Fox. So Pinling becomes both the leader in the House, and eventually by 1964, he's going to be the leader of the PLP as a whole. And between 62 and 64, H.M. Taylor, I almost said Michael Stevenson, Cyril Stevenson, and William Cartwright are kind of pushed to the side, and it becomes Pinling's party. As much as Pinling was a pragmatist, he was also a consensus builder in the early period from 63 to 68. I would argue Pinling was at his best as a leader. The reason I say that, if you talk to people like Arthur Folks, if you talk to Adie Hanna, if you talk to people who were in the fight, Eugene Newry, who is still alive, they will tell you that he was a consensus builder. When they had meetings, whether it be convention or otherwise, he would always ask for people's opinions, and he would build a consensus on a particular point or policy, and then he would go out and publicly support it. And I think that, Dale, is kind of what you were alluding to in your definition. But here's the thing. The major reason, I would argue, why the Dissident 8 happened, that eventually became the Free PLP, which eventually merged with the UBP to form the FNM, wasn't over ideology. It was over management style and leadership posturing. And after the 68 landslide election victory, Pinling, apparently, this is the allegations made by Cecil Wallace Whitfield, Warren Lavarity, and others, they're saying that Pinling increasingly moved away from a consensus-building style and started to make decisions on his own, started to make decisions which his cabinet were not always privy to. And he would then come and tell them of the decision he made after he had made it, rather than consulting them. So that was the major beef that led to the split. And it speaks to a differing management or leadership style. And unfortunately, I think as we look at our country's history in the more recent past, we have too much of the latter and not too much of the former, meaning we have too much leaders who rely on their own personality and their own charisma, and not enough on the consensus that could be built by listening to others and offering their suggestions and building consensus, right? And so one of the, just to end on this point, if you look at another example of a split in the 70s, you had the FNM fragment into the SDP and the BDP by 1977, and the FNM could not hold themselves together. And part of it was the rhetoric of Cecil, who apparently was more confrontational and charismatic, maybe along the lines of Randall Fox at an earlier point. And then you had the peacemaker and the peacekeeper and Kendall Isaacs. And it turns out it was Kendall Isaacs who ended up being the healing balm of the FNM in Gilead by 1982, bringing the party back together, but not lasting long enough, as of course he got sick and passed away untimely. So the point I'm making, though, is where you have consensus building leadership, you'll find that a party can thrive and do well. But too often we revert to I guess, the Caribbean model that I laid out: the populist rhetoric, the populist leader, the authoritarian leader, the guy who is like a one-man band, and he basically tells his cabinet what to do, and they have to basically cling to that because they know they got their cabinet position solely because of the authority that was vested in him. So I think as I end, I just wanted to reflect on the fact that what we have even now in 2021 is kind of that style of leadership overtaking the model that I think works better for our country, which is the consensus building model that I think is embedded in your definition.
Yes. So thank you, Brother Curry. Very thought-provoking. One of the things that you mentioned in there was, well, besides the fact that all of the leaders except for one, or maybe two that you talked about were authoritative and not necessarily would not have been somebody who would subscribe to the definition that I put up, right? And so forth. And so as it being a voluntary act to follow by the mere nature of the word lead. But so you said something key there in terms of passing the baton, succession.
Yeah.
And the leadership of the original PLP saw that as a need, and they had that choice, and then they went about it and decided. Now, I don't know how the decision was made to go with Pinland versus the Sarandon. Just those three made that decision, or when others, they engaged in it, and so forth. And then the other thing was, before I introduce Nahaja Black, would be the Sir Clemente Maynard. I think it was him who said to us, either under the tree or on radio or something somewhere, I can't remember. It was him and my mom was also very friendly. Said something to the fact that Pinland, since you mentioned him, was very brilliant in repackaging your ideas. And so when you talk about getting all that consensus information, and by the time as he got it and then he put it back on the table, you would have thought it was, as Sir Clem, I think, said, you would have thought it was his idea from the break, that it's something totally great. I asked that to say, you mentioned these persons up to Pinland. Has there been anybody since, and not necessarily just in the political arena, but in any leadership sphere in the Bahamas, who might have these attributes that people could look at and say, these are persons who we would want to emulate versus just because, some people touch us about the Pinland FNM PLP to do.
Yeah, before I answer that question real quick, I thought of the example of Bahamianization is a great one to support your point. That was an idea that A.D. Hanna came up with, but Pinland really rode that as a major policy point in the early 1970s. And even the idea of independence, people will tell you, was A.D. Hanna's idea. If not A.D. Hanna, I know that Randall Fox even had suggested that around 66, 67. So Pinland wasn't the originator of the idea of moving towards independence, but he certainly took the reins and ran with it once it was articulated by his party. So that's an example of a leader who is listening to the advice of others and benefiting from it. But to answer your question, the one person I think of that really inspired me as a leader was the late Dr. Rowena Bethel. And the reason I have to think about her is early in my career, I came in to COB full-time in 2003, and she was sort of installed at that point, already past her presidency. She was the president of UB or COB at the time, but when I came in, Dr. Leon Hicks had already taken over. She wasn't quite retired. She was still at the college, but what really impressed me was whenever I ran into her, she was an encourager. She was always able to know your name, to say something about you, and identify your talent and your skill set, and find a way to make you feel good about yourself, and find a way to see where you could improve yourself and work in your area of giftedness. And so Dr. Rowena Bethel reminds me of the kind of leader that I think we lack in this country. Leadership isn't about being on top of things and being the person in charge. Leadership is about making other people greater than they see in themselves.
Right. Awesome. So we're getting some background music there, which set the tone, I guess. And so we would like to welcome Nahaja Black to something to think about with Dale Happy Knowles. It's been, I guess, a long day for you, and we welcome you, and hopefully you were able to pick up on what we were talking about. This, I know, Dr. Morris will always be sharp with that. Because he's going to be able to roll, and we lost him earlier, and so he's now back also, and so we welcome you both back to the
Thank you. Thank you.
So yes, so any questions for those who were able to pick on Dr. Curry's presentation, and any comments that you might have in relation that you wanted to either challenge or support? Rowena?
Yeah. Dale. Yeah, very, very interesting history, Chris. I thoroughly like that. Probably stayed in the Bahamas up to about 10 years age, and then I was shuttled off to boarding school in England to refine me. My mother left the Bahamas several years of that, emigrated to the States. So I did not go through the whole process here, and that was quite interesting. But a little bit of history for you. William Cartwright was my stepfather. He was my mother's second husband. And it was interesting listening to his side of what took place and also listening to your rendition. But one of the things Dale invited me to speak that I was fairly consumed with was, how do you build a nation? That is how I look at political leadership. How do you move a nation forward? And as you presented the sort of overview of leadership only in the Bahamas within this region, I kind of got the sense that there was a lot more party political drive, as opposed to focusing on how my position can be used to improve the greater good. Although I realize that within the context of Bahamian history, we did go through that stage with independence and the introduction of some of the sort of pillars of nation building, not long enough. And from a vantage point, what I tended to see is in terms of leadership in the Bahamas, it's more about who controls one party versus the other. And that carries over even to when they may be in government, as opposed to, which is, I am no longer the head of party. I now lead a nation, and every person in this nation is a child of mine, and I am as beholden to person X as I am to person, whatever they are, whatever their situation may be, whatever their political leanings may be. I am beholden to these people. And I wondered whether you could explain, well, one, whether you agree with me, because that in the sense very strong. I returned to the Bahamas in 1982 when I finished law school, the only one of my mother's children that decided to come back. And I sensed during that time this one, a sort of what I see happening a lot, or has happened a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, where the maximum leader comes along and he's strong and he takes on everybody, but he's fighting about party politics as opposed to moving the nation forward. Yes, certain things are done that is painted in the umbrella of moving the nation forward and improving the general lot of people. But when you actually kind of analyze that and go a little bit deeper, what it is, it boils down, in my view, to rewarding those who have supported me. So I see basically leadership in this country has been an issue of, team sports, team politics.
Yeah.
I know that's kind of harsh, but anybody else?
No, I think that's an astute observation. I think that the problem with party politics is that you have people who just want to hold on to power, and so they're not interested in being visionaries and passing laws or doing things that might be unpopular, but actually might be for the better, or as you put, the common good of the people. And so there's a sort of knee-jerk reaction where a lot of times our politicians are just trying to maintain power rather than doing things that are proactive and are visionary and have long-term consequences, right? So they're just trying to survive in the fishbowl of party politics. And unfortunately, it means that they're often reacting to things, and they're only doing things as a Band-Aid approach to a bigger problem. And they're only thinking about the present, and they're not looking down the road at the future. And they're not thinking about enacting a national development plan, because all of the kind of things that they should be doing aren't going to help them in the present with party politics and where we flip-flop since 1997. All of that doesn't help the cause. So you're absolutely right that we've been sort of in an unfortunate rat race and hamster wheel, so to speak, where we're spinning our wheels and our leaders aren't really being visionary because of the party politics scenario.
Awesome. Nahaja, you have anything you want to add to that?
I don't speak when smart people are speaking. I politely sit in my corner and absorb. So I will gladly wait my turn and not interject when enough has been said. So that was wonderful contributions by both.
You're funny.
You're too funny.
She sounds like a leader. She sounds like the leader of a political party.
Rowena, it's so good to see you. But hopefully it's a leader of a political party that makes sense one day.
I put in my cowrie shell for you. This is my ode to Africa.
I see it. You look fabulous, darling. You look fabulous.
Yeah. So
thank you, darling.
So, Doc, the idea of succession in that period of time, then, or when we talk about the strong leader, because I grew up in an era where the strongest leaders were women, and they were the mothers and the women of the community, and so. But I was eager to hear if you were going to call any women's names when you were giving your recital. Or whatever you call it.
Well, that's why when you asked me that question, about examples, I went to Rowena Bethel because she reminded me of the kind of leader that we need. Someone who isn't about power or holding on to power for themselves, and who's not interested in their own agenda, but they're empowering other people. And they make other people feel important, and in so doing, they're able to galvanize more people behind their particular cause. Dr. Rowena Bethel, I believe, was in fact the longest, I got to talk to Nicolette about this, the longest tenured president and the first president of COB. And so that speaks volumes to her. I think she's a legend, and she's of course long gone, but she's not forgotten. But if you want to press the button a little further about women in leadership, one could easily go back to the 1950s and 60s and the suffragette movement. Individuals like Doris Johnson, certainly, and Mabel Walker comes to mind. She was not a Bahamian. She married into the Bahamas through C.R. Walker, but she was a formidable force, and she was the first president of the Bahamas Union of Teachers. So she strikes me as an amazing woman. Of course, we have a union house and a school named after her. Even Mary Ingram, the first president of the women's suffrage movement, demonstrated the kind of leadership that I think we lack. And interestingly, she was the first president, but when Doris came back with her PhD from the University of Toronto, Mary stepped aside and she saw in Doris something that she didn't have. She saw that Doris would be a better public speaker, would be the spokesperson for the movement in a way that she couldn't. And so again, to me, that typifies the kind of leader that we have so few of, the selfless person who is more interested in getting the policy or the movement advanced than their own self-aggrandizement.
Right, awesome. Well, we thank you for what you said so far. Actually, we're going to come back to a lot of that. Go ahead, Rowena.
I had another observation that I wanted to make in relation to this issue of leadership in the Bahamas in particular. And I kind of look at it, and we want, and as Chris spoke, actually, it came back to my mind, we want a Moses, we want a savior. And I think that was a natural reaction to come out of the era of slavery. We needed somebody who could handle the white guys, as it were, take them on, speak at their level, and basically let them know I can think as, I'm just as educated as you are, so I can handle all of these philosophical discussions. As time progresses, and I'll contrast this with perhaps those countries that do well on the well-being and happiness indices every year, the Nordic countries and New Zealand, for example. But the leaders tend to, I have seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, the leaders cobble together, or maybe deliberate, maybe cobble is not a nice word, or not a nice phrase. They put together a team of people, and I get the sense that half of them they don't trust, but it's on the basis that you keep your friends close, but you keep your enemies even closer. Mm-hmm. And consequently, there's this struggle that goes on within the leadership arena, because it's only the leader is, we look at that as the one person, but it's impossible for one person to make to create the environment and to make the changes that are needed. That person needs a team, and that team needs a machinery. And I would have shared this with Dale earlier. In my opinion, there's been weaknesses in that team, and the weaknesses that I've seen have come from fundamentally a lack of trust in relation to a number of them within the team, but you don't let them out, you just keep them close. Mm-hmm. Or you do away with any resistance, and you put people who are just too afraid to open their mouths and challenge what the leader says. And then you have the executing machinery or the implement machinery. And for us, I look at public administration, public service, and to me, that is inordinately decayed, outdated, and weak. It's a relic from, in my opinion, it's a relic from our colonial days. It hasn't changed a great deal. If there's been superficial changes, certainly a lot of the mindset remains as it was in those days. And as a result, I think it's going to take an extraordinarily strong one person as leader to make the changes that are necessary to properly set the country on the course for nation building. He must also be prepared to get cut down, not only from within his ranks, but obviously also from perhaps within the machinery as well. Mm-hmm. But I think that has to do also with whether or not our leaders are completely committed to moving the country forward, or they're committed moving their party's interest forward. I believe by and large, it's really moving the party's interest forward as opposed to the country. Certainly that's been my observation.
Great. So you've segued us very well into the subject or the topic that I gave assigned to you to present, which is the sustainable democratic policy, the leadership engine of success. Or is that the democratic policy, the leadership engine of success? And so you mentioned a few things just now that I think is going to be very critical in the long run. But one of the things is that our structure and our environment in which we will operate, will that needs to be conducive for us to have proper leadership and proper performance within the system throughout all levels. And leadership, as I was taught, is not reserved for a person who sits in a hierarchy or at the apex of any organization. Leadership happens throughout the organization, from the janitor straight up. It's an action. And so if you would now share with us your thoughts on the sustainable democratic policy for the leadership engine for success. How do you see, with your background in public administration and the like, how does that machinery change? But you talk about the civil service and the rest is antiquated. My mouth getting tired. I'll keep quiet and listen.
Outdated.
Yeah, outdated, yes.
Yeah. I guess most of my thoughts and ideas were formed during the 10-year period that I was a member of the United Nations Committee of Experts in Public Administration. Prior to that, I did not properly understand the impact, the machinery that political leaders rely on to execute their policies, how fundamentally important that was in success and in nation building. I think that what we saw happening after the Millennium Development Goals were completed was a recognition. Millennium Development Goals were basically these sort of threshold targets that were set to, in fact, lift populations around the world out of poverty, targeted in developing countries. But I think what came out of that was the need to introduce some streamlined coherence in policies. And I don't know that message has quite got across. So you got focus on things like a whole of government approach, and being able to recognize all of the cross-cutting issues so that at the end of the day, when a policy is implemented, it's not done in a fragmented way and it doesn't miss important connectors or relationships that exist. For example, I know that Tony Blair had set as one of his main policies ending poverty. Included in ending poverty were things like dealing with health issues, dealing with housing issues, dealing with educational issues, dealing with full employment, issues like that. So it was important to ensure basically that at the highest level that there was a focus on, singular policy, although these may involve separate agencies. Now, when you get to the issue of separate agencies, it's important to be able to find a mechanism to get them to work collaboratively and to coordinate their activities. What I have found is that many good ideas and many policy ideas fail because the connecting or the relationship agencies were never involved in the discussion, in the design, in the implementation. And consequently, you have an outcome that falls short of its target and everybody's confused and scratching their heads because, it was just such a brilliant idea. But the idea cannot work because people's lives don't work in silos. So to me, that is one way that we have to address this issue of how do you kind of go about implementing policies that have impacts. What it also requires is a level of coordination and consensus. Chris mentioned this before, at cabinet level. My experience, and I'm speaking from experience, is that there isn't often a great deal of consensus. Well, there may be consensus at cabinet, but once the meeting is over or wherever the decisions are taken, everybody goes back to their separate ministries and they all embark on different journeys in different directions, when in fact what's needed is for several of them to come together. Now, a lot of this comes about because of ego. And ministers like to be able to say, I did this and I did this. And a classic example was how we started off e-government. Every minister wanted to have his own website. Every minister wanted to do his own thing. At the end of the day, what you had was chaos. What you really needed was a website that dealt with my issue related to, for example, pregnancy. That meant I needed to understand what my medical benefits may be. I need to understand what my maternity leave entitlements are. All of that is coordinated, and all of that should be sort of in one place, as opposed to me going to the Ministry of Labor's website and then trotting off the National Insurance Board's website. We need to draw all of that together. In the absence of that, we end up, to me, spinning wheels and wasting time. Another contributing factor from my point of view, is this upheaval that one goes through. There ought to be a degree of continuity within the service, because policies really ought to be developed with long-term goals and with long-term objectives in mind. what has happened since we started our one-term stint is that each incoming administration wipes the slate clean, pretty much. It introduces, chops things off in midstream, introduces a whole new group of people. I'm not entirely sure how much transition activity takes place, but that is disruptive. You have people that come in that may not have had the benefit of understanding what the history was behind some, why it worked the way it worked, why it didn't work the way it worked. And therefore, we're unable to really show any progress. And what then happens is when we find ourselves in situations of reviews, we are literally sitting there in front of potential multilateral bodies, for example, explaining a situation as if it started 2 weeks ago, when it may have had a history going back 10 years. So to me, what is important in sustainability is we've got to build the machinery that we rely on. And again, that is public administration. Now, that's not so easy, I think, in our context, because the sort of, I guess, the education that many countries would have gone through to get to the point where they are, the issues of openness, the issues of engaging the public in deciding basically how you resolve problems that impact the public, we have not gone through to the extent that you see elsewhere. As a result, we still to this day will go and implement something. There is a massive backlash from the public, and then we have to turn around and shift gears. That is not conducive, and it's not constructive. It's costly. It is just disruptive within the system itself, because you don't know to what extent procedures may have been implemented, budgets may have been expended in implementing something that really is counterproductive. So from my perspective, I believe that if, in fact, we have leaders, political leaders, who are truly interested in moving the nation forward, then we have to begin to look at the machinery that they are going to rely on, and a machinery that's going to essentially ensure that the people that you serve have a voice before as much as possible, because there are going to be cases where the emergencies, but before these plans are implemented, let people feed into the plans, let people explain the situation as they see it, let them understand the impacts. I remember several years ago, I attended a UN meeting in Bolivia, and we were talking about basically these initiatives that were tackling social issues in communities. And I was asked to speak about the Urban Renewal Project at the time. And I got some materials. And what was impressive to the attendees and the UN was the fact that many of these urban renewal centers were in areas where fathers were largely absent. The police officers were filling father roles. And I remember talking to some of the police officers who said that if the child didn't go to school, they themselves went to the home and they spoke to the children, particularly the young boys. But to me, the UN was very impressed that the Bahamas, we actually had, I don't know whether it was by design or whether we stumbled upon it, but we actually were able to fill a void. In that as well were these bands that they had put together. And as trivial as that may seem to somebody, if you can find something that can occupy young boys, and that can keep them focused, that can keep them interested in positive activity, go for it. But when I was told that the police officers, the male police officers in particular, were in these centers that acted as after-school homework centers, and that were there, teachers were having issues with the boys, could go to the school and talk to the teachers, and then come home and talk to the young boys. That was impactful. I don't know where the Urban Renewal Program is today, but certainly if that has continued, that is important, because that gets to me to the very heart of how we begin to correct some of the social ills that have resulted in the unfortunate circumstance that many of our young men end up in. But again, that was an holistic approach, because I understood that within the urban renewal centers, there were representatives from social service, the police. Some people were not in favor of the police in charge, but I think in our context, maybe it worked because the police represented an authority figure that many of our young boys did not otherwise have. So it's something that I thought was very good. Again, it was done at the community community level, at the very basic level, and it was able to help mold these young people as they were coming up. There was somebody who was interested in them. There was somebody who was there to listen to them. Mommy may have been at work, she couldn't be with them, but at the community center, they had a sense of normalcy to some degree, and adults that showed an interest in their development. It's tackling problems in that way that I think is extremely important. Now, how this is done elsewhere was basically most governments would, and you will find this particularly in the advanced countries, they sat down and their approach was to look at how do you tackle all of these issues. Again, how do you tackle the economic issues? How do you tackle the social issues? How do you tackle the environmental issues? What are the outcomes of all of not tackling these issues? And how do you begin to work with it? So we have to start by recognizing that the delivery mechanism is not working. The siloed approach in government is not working. So we have to find ways to get government agencies to work in teams focused on, in thematic areas to actually address these issues. And you have that straight up the line in government. Ruth Miller actually had something similar to this years ago when the government was introducing anchor projects. She had teams of representatives. Actually, it was the PSs of the various ministries that met, and straight down line, each PS would then assign officers and their agents work in ministerial teams in order to address the issues, so that had a coherent approach to resolving issues, and they moved up the line. And then right at the top, at the cabinet level, obviously you could have cabinet subcommittees involved, so that at that point when they had to deal with the policy issues, they would have been fed appropriately from their technocrats and their administrators as to what's happening. And then you had an outcome that was holistic, that everybody understood, everybody could buy into. But my understanding is that that's not always achievable because of the territoriality that exists even at cabinet level. Yeah. So for me, I know that the question is how we deal with sustainability in democracy. I don't like sort of veering too much into the discussion on democracy, because I'm a little bit concerned about getting into theory without looking at how in practice things are supposed to work on the ground, things that are real, things that are going to touch the lives of little children as they come up, so that they are model citizens later on down the line, and things that are going to get leaders sensitized to what is happening in all the corners of this country that can move the country forward. I mentioned earlier the issue of well-being and happiness. And these are indices that several of them that operate around the globe. And the happiest countries always tend to be the Nordic countries, always tend to be the New Zealands of this world. And the reason for that is that they have very open systems. Openness is another important factor. I believe that we have struggled with openness in the Bahamas because so much of our economic success hinged on secrecy for such a long time. And also secrecy was for a long while synonymous with power. If you kept everything to yourself, particularly within the service, then it meant that you were powerful. You knew more than everybody else, and only you could give the answer to something. But when you look at the level of openness, I think what it does is that it creates opportunities to get the citizenry involved in helping to solve problems, solve issues. When everything is a mystery and you're simply being fed an edict, it doesn't help for, I think, many citizens who sit back and think, well, that's a stupid idea because they missed out this, they missed out that, they missed out the net. But that can't work in practice because they didn't think about this or they didn't think about that. And we see a lot of that happening. You see less of that in sort of more advanced countries because the time is taken. And one town hall meeting per event is not sufficient. Town hall meetings, work within a certain context, but we've got to find the means by which there is a constant and open ability for the citizens to engage and give their things. We are thinking about setting up a Disney cruise port on the end of your island, just pull something out of the air. What are your views on this? Citizens say, oh, we're a bit concerned about this, we're concerned about that. You then, as the technocrats and the public servants, you can think about that, and together you all can work on a solution because you are in a position then to share with them what you see the benefits are, and if the issues they have, you may be able to find workarounds, but you do it with the people. You do not. I mean, to me, the worst way to try and foist policy forward is to say you take it or you leave it because you get massive reactions. Additionally, I think now in our country, we have sufficient of our people who are well educated. We fully understand what all these concepts are. We have been involved with this many, many times. A lot of our younger ones are go off school fairly early. Other than that, we're all of us have the ability to engage even outside. I'm working on a project with the UN at the moment, and I was able to go, to the Australian website and actually sign up for all the services. This is the level of openness that we have to be looking at, but we have to do it with people who we intend to impact. Okay, and to me, unless we are prepared to look at our citizenry as real partners in building and moving forward, we're constantly going to have this tug of war at the party level, and then this tug of war with the general citizenry moving forward. And at the end of the day, even those who think they're benefiting in the end may not be able to benefit.
Awesome stuff. So when we look at what you just said in a big way,
it's an awful lot, but
yes. So you mentioned at the beginning the connecting of agency, the coordinating, the consensus, the continuation for long-term objectives and the like, and so forth. And so when we look at that whole picture, and we have a real current example in our independence celebration of the ceremony of apex for our country, of the flag raising and everything, and the Bahamian artists complaining that nobody consulted with them. So you're suggesting, from what I'm taking, is that you can use policy to structurally cause those three things to happen: the connection of agency, the coordination, the consensus, and stuff. Policy can be structured in such a way to cause those things to automatically happen in such a way. Is that what I'm hearing you to say as a nutshell?
Absolutely. And that's done elsewhere. Basically, governments determine that they wanted, and we've mentioned it, I've heard them talk about it. We're great with buzzwords. We absolutely love words du jour. But what we need to do is to make that a reality in practice. So the government decides that it's going to look at ways of restructuring how decision-making happens in government, okay? And it requires those agencies that should be involved to work together so that the outcome is holistic and the outcome actually does address the mischief or the policy that they wanted to tackle. So they can make that decision. Now, having said that, although, as I said, I've heard it a lot, I can say to you in recent discussions that there is a tension to a certain degree between a lot of the ministries. There's a peculiar, and there has been for a long time, I noticed this when I was in government, there's a peculiar level of competition between ministers that make absolutely no sense whatsoever to me, because at the end of the day, even if this minister does something in his ministry and another minister fails, as far as Bahamians are concerned, the whole government ain't no good.
Yeah.
So I would have thought logic would say we all work together to produce a particular outcome. At the end of the day, it's a decision of government. It is not one ministry versus another ministry. And my experience is not sufficient of that has happened in government. And I see that still has not been added, certainly not to the levels of your OECD countries or your Nordic countries or your New Zealand countries, where your gauge in relation to all of this is how satisfied are your citizens with government. I'm not talking about how satisfied am I with my party. I'm talking about, is my life better? Do my children have prospects? Am I able to send my children to decent school? Will my lights stay on? Okay, do I have decent water? All of those things we still have to address in an holistic way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So is that happening because we don't have diversity of generations in our system of leadership, in our positions of leadership? It's all, I don't want to say senior, but what's the word I'm looking for? Dr. Curry, I know you got all the words in your dictionary. There's very little young people.
Veterans is the word you're looking for.
Yes, we only have those, and so they all come from. I mean, generations have their overall thought process, their mindset, and so is it because everybody who are dominating in the leadership positions are all in a certain set, and we don't have the diversity? Do those other countries have a diversity in their systems?
Well, New Zealand has a woman, can I say, first of all?
Yeah, well, not just the woman, but I mean in terms of the age differences. Yeah.
The problem we have is one that's referred to as horizontalization. And that is that generation after generation, because of what Ms. Bethel said, we have a party imperative. You have the same people in every political cycle are at the trough, the same set of people over and over again. And so there's no room for young people to grow. If you look at other countries, your prime ministers, your senior civil servants, your senior, even members of the police force, they pass on to become members of the board of trustees of research institutes and review bodies and things like that, that improve civil society and improve governance. And these things are important for small countries. Can you imagine if you had ombudsmen who were retired judges, retired police commissioners, retired prime ministers, and so on, who were there outside of government but within civil society, sitting on boards and offering independent reports on the governance and functions of boards? This is what Bermuda has done by creating the Institute of Directors, where even small businesses are required for that. We suffer from a horizontalization. And so in sociological terms, there's no intergenerational transfer of power, authority, and status. And so everyone finds themselves bunched up against generation after generation, bunched up against the line. And you'll see, even when the parties change, the same old retreads are sort of rewound into the system. And so there's no place for ideas and innovation to rise up through the system. And even when you have a situation like that, Bermuda has something, Cayman has something, Dubai has something, New Zealand has something, Singapore has something they call a sandbox. And a sandbox is a policy that is, or a set of principles or concepts that's not yet policy. And what they do is they take people like the people gathered on this in this interview, my colleagues, and they say, look, here is an idea. We don't know what to do with it, but hash it out amongst yourselves and then come back to us, right? With a set of ideas. And this is not a one-off thing. It's happening over and over again. If you teach in Washington, D.C., the Defense Intelligence Agency comes to find you. They say, hey, we have an issue we want to look at. You know, is China going to outpace the United States? And they invite 100 scholars in. They give you lunch and 10 grand, and then you hash it out for the day. They record that, analyze that, and so on, break it down and generate policy. People who have the leading ideas get called back and so on. This happens on a daily, not on a one-off thing, on a daily basis. It doesn't need a crisis to occur. And we don't have that kind of dynamism in our government. And so it's very, very difficult for new ideas to penetrate.
Yes, thank you, Doc. I think that touched a lot of what I was saying. So, Dr. Curry and Madam Black, any comments you want to add to the commentary just now from Ms. Bethel and what Doc brought to the table, Morris?
I figure I better say something or they'll be questioning why I'm here. So I better just add something as fluff. But I will say that, you know, of course, for me, honestly, as I'm sitting here listening to the discourse, I'm always floored with the fact that we have to have these conversations, but there's very little mobilization to the level at which we speak, right? So I'm always curious as to, not curious, but I'm always stunned, flabbergasted that we can have these types of conversations with Dr. Bethel, Dr. Gilbert. I figure I should say Dr. Curry, Dr. Gilbert, and I should say Dr. Bethel as well, that we're having this level of discourse here, Dale. And I wonder if this level of discourse, I mean, what do? They stop us at the ground floor in Parliament? Like, what happens when so when we talk about the sustainability of it, I do believe that the effort must come just with the initial discussion on who we elect. I think all of this is great energy used, but when it's not actually implemented, I find for me that I get easily frustrated and I ask the questions, what is the point? Mm-hmm. What is the point of all of this intelligent discourse if it's just intelligent discourse amongst five in the general public? But are we expecting this level of discourse? Are we expecting this level of not just intellectual back and forth, but the implementation of just basic principles and policy, basic understandings of that, as Rowena said, that policies and the plans touch the young men and women that we're seeking for it to touch. And so for me, I love the discussion, but most times I listen because I find that I feel like we're on this little merry-go-round of smart people. Like we have so many smart people, but they seem not to somehow end up anywhere where they're useful other than in university. No offense, Doc. Either docs.
You know that these things will build on each other. And when momentum picks up, then things start to happen. And so momentum can pick up that any as an engineer, I'll tell you that there's no great design or no great invention or no great execution of anything that ever happened that didn't start with a thought. And
you're right on that one.
Right? So, I mean, I hear you, I understand what you're saying, and that's really good. And my hope is for these discussions and the like, not just to be one-off.
Dale, please forgive me. I have a talk show. You know, I tell you guys get paid for this. I'm just tired of talking. That's just.
I'm saying, I know what you're saying. I'm not knocking you for what you're saying.
No, and I'm not knocking this. I support this. That's why I'm here. I want to be here, but I'm not smart enough for this conversation. I keep telling you. I don't know what you brought me here for, Dale.
Well, you'll be surprised to know. Because, I mean,
engineers have to design things. Person. You're the right person.
Can I tell you?
Everybody in the Bahamas has a contribution.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Morris.
No, perhaps Dr. Curry will speak first, and then I'll follow him.
Oh, I didn't. The only thing I wanted to add was, the fundamental problem we have in leadership is it boils down to a failure of communication. We have a deficit in communication. Yes. You were talking about Ms. Bethel, how people operate in silos and how we need to take a holistic approach. But what I see at a basic level, I'll just give it a simple example. Cabinet ministers have at their fingertips PSs, permanent secretaries with a vast amount of experience and knowledge, and yet so few of them tap into that resource. And so few of them actually recognize that they could get the information they're presenting in Parliament, whether it be a bill or something else that they're debating, from their own PSs. But, that's just a failure to prepare and a failure to communicate at some level. And we see this across the board in the Bahamas, is that our government is not fully prepared to communicate with each other. And so at different levels, you see failure. And so this idea of working in silos happens. And so rather than dismantle the system, we continue to run that same race. We're like, we're like this. We're like we're in a car race, but we're racing with a beat down Chevy from 1957 when we should be racing with a Porsche. You know what I mean?
But that's just car.
Well, I support those comments, and I'll say two things. In Estonia, there's a gentleman called Linar Vik. Linar Vik has the most unique job title or job description anywhere. His job is every day to find an idea, a concept, or a policy that will drive Estonia forward. That's his job. Mm-hmm. Every day, across the entire government. That's one. Number two, I participated in a conference to redesign the Turks and Caicos Constitution, where I was appointed to the all-party committee at the House of Lords in 2009 as a special envoy from the Office of the Premier. And what we proposed, following what Dr. Curry said and what Ms. Bethel said, and also what Nahaja said, was the permanent secretary. We proposed that they have a budget that at their level, they become the knowledge center. Mm-hmm. They're the knowledge center. And at their level, they can hire experts to aid them in building policy so that they could advise ministers appropriately. They understand the functioning of the government, they understand the capacity of the government, and they understand the intellectual freight of the ideas. So if at that level, and this is important when you have a national university, they should be able to call on scholars. So I'm not in the university Dr. Curry is. They shouldn't call me first. They should call Dr. Curry. Dr. Curry should then say, let me get Ms. Bethel and Morris and all these people and build them in so that look at the amount of institutions that are touched by that and the knowledge transfer that takes place. And this is how you deepen participation and break out of the silos and stretch those ideas and policy options across a broad panoply of the society. Our problem is, and I'm sorry to say this like this, but most of our leaders have never been important for anything before they got into politics. And most of them have never worked in a collegial environment where constant assessment, criticism, and so on is necessary, not just to advance, but to maintain your position. Just to maintain your position. I was giving the example the other day that if you're going to become a professor, Dr. Curry, you know this, in Britain or in France or in the United States, Japan, any one of these places, you have to, when you're hired, no one person hires you. A faculty senate engages you. You sit there with a panel of experts and they go at you. You know, can you give an outline of the bibliography in this field and the 5 formative ideas, and can you give the pro and con and give an establishment of some of the, you know, asymmetrical ideas that have operated in this field? You have to answer, right? Can you give the leading papers in this field over the last 25 years and why you find them significant? And can you establish the critical nexus in which they exist? You have to answer. So the permanent secretaries, first of all, they have to be the faculty senate of the government. They have to operate like the faculty senate of the government. And they are the lodestar of all governmental knowledge. But you have to reach outside of them. And our problem in the Caribbean is we have ossified government so much in pride of place that most government positions are just another form of status making. And so the individual is there to establish a status for him or herself. So they need all ideas to appear as if it comes from them. They cannot risk collegiality because they need all the points of good ideas and all the complements and references to apply to them so that they can maintain their place in the system.
Yes, and that's what we started out talking about in the strengths of strong leaders over the years as we talk. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look. Oh boy. Back with you. That was a pretty decent, depth, and provocative discussion when we hope that you would have had all your questions and concerns answered in their presentations. And if not, please shoot us a note. Let us know what is still on the table so that we could either bring them back to answer them for you, or I might be able to answer some of them myself. You know, all this going off the top of my head, that means that there's some brains in there somewhere. I shake my head sometimes and I hear echo, but you never know. So cool. But we'd like to thank you all for sticking around and enjoying the show, gaining all this knowledge that is on the table. And let's use it all together so we can build the Bahamas one step at a time, one stepping stone at a time, so that we can have a better quality of life for us all. And we trust as you enjoy the rest of your evening that you have a safe and joyful and prosperous dinner. Because that's where I'm going to hit right now. Somewhere around there. We're going to touch that down and we will all be back next week for our Emancipation Show, where we can dive deep into the thoughts that go on with emancipation and the significance of it in our society. Thank you kindly, Madam Producer. Thank you again. Enjoy.
Enjoyed the show? Then subscribe to us for more educational and inspirational content. Ring the bell so you never miss a show. Let's change the narrative 242